what goes into a move? Power? Cost? The threat? But what actually makes you care about any of these numbers and words? The delivery. Pokémon didn't invent new techniques of animation, but it's nice to talk about them because the series has lasted so long that we can see these different elements emerge in their games over their 3 decades of existence, going from single images to 3D models. So why don't people universally view these later installments as improvements? Are they just clouded by nostalgia? Or is there something else going on? Perhaps the answer's relative. See, you can call me Nordist, and I've been working on effects of my own as I'm working on my own creature collector based off of STEM topics. Still got a lot to do on my end, but working on an RPG gave me a new perspective on these move animations. While I was writing this video, only then did I see that a very comprehensive video about Pokemon battle animations was made by New Frame Plus a while ago, linked above. But today I'll be focusing on the elements in move animations that should be applicable to game projects in general. This video was getting so long that I needed to split it in 2 parts, with talking about 2D techniques today and talking about 3D in the next video. So with all that said, let's start in the 1990s. Pokemon was originally made for the Game Boy, where the game files themselves were like 400 to 500 kilobytes and the console screen had 160 by 144 pixels. To put that into perspective, here's how those numbers look compared to the latest games, which were made for the Nintendo Switch. The games had to be much smaller both in file and screen size to present all of their story and combat. So, what got in the game? Well, that's not actually the right question to ask here. I should rather be asking, what did the combat have? Because a large portion of the effects didn't require new assets. Recoloring and shaking the screen and or sprites were techniques from the very first RPGs dating back to the 1980s, as these transformations don't need to make or add any new sprites, as you just remove, displace, or recolor the sprites that you already have. And this was able to make some pretty convincing effects, shaking up the player experience. Hold up right there. What do you mean convincing? These are just 2 images floating in purgatory, just occasionally spitting out other images at each other. So remember, things are relative. The surrounding world is simple enough for people to assume that things are happening in the battle even if they're not explicitly depicted. But even here, I want to point out how there's some small additions that can make a big impact. Like the UI shaking that makes certain moves feel very powerful, as it's able to reach out of the game's universe and affect your perspective. Here comes an important facet of animation. Timing. A quicker snap can make an attack feel more physical and give a kick to what little changes there are in the game. Because yes, the Pokemon themselves are just 2 still images facing each other. Now I want to make a quick note about this flashing effect because we kind of start seeing this phase out in later generations. Understandably so, because it's grating to the eyes, right? Well, that's because it wasn't meant to be seen by your screen. Game Boy screens turn the pixel on to color it in, meaning that the white areas here are actually parts of the screen that were turned off. In contrast, the depiction on your screen is probably emitting white light into your eyes in those spaces instead. If we think about flashes as removing an asset briefly, we can find these kind of flashes in later games. Now, there are plenty of custom sprites dedicated just for the moves alone. This is how the earliest 2D animations were usually done, right? A quick replacement of keyframes? But what's notable here is that the Pokemons are standing in the same spots of the screen for every battle. I mean, the Pokemon sprites might deform or change color in later consoles, but the changes were simple enough that any move can be applied to any creature, which is a practice that Pokemon would continue for nearly all of their games that have combat. Because how else would you keep up with hundreds of different creatures, each knowing dozens of moves? Before moving on, I wanted to mention that sound also plays a big role in a move, but I want to have that discussion separately because I'm still in the middle of making some myself. So for now, we'll just continue with these move animations. I can't point out every new effect, but Gen 2 would add more distortions and more notably, at the end of the generation, more keyframes to the Pokemons themselves. Remember how animation is just a bunch of frames shown over time? So these frames can be drawn uniquely, or previous frames can be transformed. We're using the mathematical definition of transformations here, where some kind of function is applied to that keyframe, like move everything over a few pixels, or repeat a row of pixels. Theoretically, we can have a function that micromanages each of the pixels to turn a sprite into a completely new image. But at that point, it should be easier just to draw that new frame by hand. And most transformations are supposed to be applicable to any asset to save time, right? But we'll get back to this idea very soon. Gen 3 Pokemon tackles a rather difficult transformation: rotation. Rotation is pretty painful both in 2D and 3D for completely different reasons. But let's just talk 2D today. When these pixel sprites are drawn, they'll tell each pixel exactly what color they should be. But when you rotate that sprite, these squares don't fit the pixels on the screen. So how should it represent that? There are several ways. One, you could calculate like, this is 60% of some color, so that whole pixel could be that color, resulting in a crisp yet possibly weird looking frame. Or you can have some form of anti-aliasing, where you find a completely new color, maybe even with some transparency, that's the fair average of what that pixel is supposed to be. This causes a smoother yet possibly blurry image. There are several different algorithms to figure that average out. For Gen 3 Pokemon, I don't think the rotations made new colors. In fact, we can see this clearer in another effect, where the sprite's resolution seemingly gets lowered, as a larger area of pixels are now told to be the same color. We could use this as a segue to another kind of transform: scaling. So the first two gens kinda had scaling for Pokemon popping out of the Pokeball, but there the sprite was cut up into fragments and placed to overlap each other. See, a better way to scale is doing the same thing, but with smaller fragments and an algorithm to determine what color that pixel should be instead of completely overlapping the parts. I hope you can imagine how scaling things bigger also needs some kind of algorithm to determine what color the new pixel should be. Without any form of anti-aliasing, you might see jagged edges like in these generations of Pokemon. However, it can be an intentional stylistic choice. Now Gen 3 also had a technique called masking. Technically, Gen 2 had this as well in some of their moves, but I think it's best seen with Gen 3's stat changes. Remember how a function can theoretically tell each pixel to be something else entirely? Well, if transparencies are kept, this can be quite useful as a pattern that can be overlaid on top of any sprite to represent a character-specific change. In a way, it's like how sprites were recolored back in the day. But this time, instead of having a blanket statement to add a certain color, now you're matching the pixel locations with the pixels of another pattern. Gen 3 also started to have different backgrounds and intros in their battles. I can imagine that a similar method was used to change set background when certain moves were played. This addition is probably the most notable of the ones mentioned so far, because we see it in every battle, even if the move doesn't change it. This makes a big difference from the previous Game Boy games, as the art would only become more embellished in future titles. Okay, in Gen 4, I'm convinced that Pokemon started to use particle systems here. Where the previous animations were mostly baked in, where every frame was explicitly drawn or put on a predetermined path, particle systems can make these effects not only different every time, but more importantly, easier to make. You let the hardware simulate when and where a particle could appear and possibly how they would move using certain functions instead of painstakingly drawing every frame. And heck, this might even look better, at a fraction of the labor. Honestly, other than the new art style they had for each of the sprites, I don't think there's any more major changes in Gen 4 battles. Graphically and technically, it felt like a very solid identity, with colored sprites and backgrounds and effects that can be pulled from a variety of techniques. With the upcoming generation, I would say that there is one major element that greatly elevates the graphics, but that generation also introduced a mildly controversial addition as well. So let's talk about the good, the controversial, and the pretty. Pretty ominous, that is. See, that last one was referring to how we started to see 3D shapes in battle animations. That's right. Even in the Nintendo DS, not even 3DS, some games were able to run in 3D. Heck, the previous Pokemon generation also had 3D backgrounds, but the battles were still 2D back then. There's many ways to simulate 3D shapes with 2D ones through transformations in respect to the camera, but in Gen 5 there seems to be a genuine 3D space here. I say this because of not only the background, but some moves seem to use this other dimension. Also with this 3D space, we can see the use of a very important element to animation as a whole: staging. Or I guess the more relevant word here is the camera. The camera now pans in and out of the shot, emphasizing who is affected. It even ducks in a little when you send in your Pokemon, and moves side to side depending on which Pokemon you're targeting in double battles. When you have control of your camera, you can make shots feel very dynamic, even with the little material you've got. As important as a dynamic camera is often forgotten by most viewers because they are immersed into perspective, which is fine. I mean, how long has it been since you noticed that nose between your eyes? Still, it's certainly something people would notice when it's gone. The camera, not the nose. But lastly, here's a controversial change, where Pokemon sprites now have puppet animations. I first wanted to gloss over this as I went over it in a previous video, but see, I was about to say that people were generally happy with the Pokemon graphics so far, where most view the additions in these 2D games as improvements. But the one element I did see people criticize were these puppets. 2D animation is about showing a bunch of different frames, right? And drawing each of those frames not only is a lot of work, but it's also a lot of files to fit on the console. And even though the DS is much more powerful than the Game Boys of before, why use that extra space on animating the same old Pokemon instead of making new content? So these puppets were a clever way to make new poses and in-between frames as sprites were cut up into pieces and transformed to go from one pose to another. This calculated transition is often referred to as tweening in digital animation. This allowed for a constant idle animation to keep something on the screen moving, even more so than before, and possibly changing pace according to the actions made in battle. On top of this, there were more sprites as well to help smoothen the different poses, but some people found this style off-putting. At the end of the day, everyone has their own tastes and preferences. I personally can see how this is a major departure from the limited transformations of before, and personally there was always something uncanny about animations that overly relied on tweening, where it's mostly remedied by having more unique frames or had more detailed parts to tween. Still, apart from the tweening preferences, I believe that up to this point, most people did view the Pokemon graphics as improvements. Sure, most people were young and there were fewer discussions online than today, but even in hindsight, because Pokemon would repeatedly do their older games with updated graphics on the new console, following nearly the same story. When people like the Johto games, most refer others to Heart Gold and Soul Silver instead of Gold, Silver, or Crystal, which indicates to me that most people agree that the visual changes are indeed upgrades from the franchise's monochrome beginnings. Now, is the nostalgia point completely moot? Now, there are people who adamantly like their childhood products over anything new, but I don't want to paint that view as a majority. Admittedly, the biggest leap in graphics people would notice is probably the backgrounds in Gen 3. But see, the main criticism Pokemon games were having so far weren't necessarily the graphics, but rather that the games always felt the same. I believe that has more to do with the gameplay than the visuals, because there have been hundreds of new creatures and many new additions to the visual presentation as we've seen so far. As an aside, Pokemon also added quite a lot of new moves and effects to change the gameplay, but my ongoing theory was that the easy difficulty and ability to overlevel in the campaign didn't push people to use these new moves, eventually giving them the same experience as before, just spamming super effective attacks. But with the visuals, the stylized world still left a lot to the imagination. It felt completely fine even though people were scrunched down in the overworld, and Pokemon sank into the floor upon defeat, because it's relative. People aren't expecting the style to be realistically accurate all the time, unless you're dorkly. But things started to change when we entered the third dimension. For better or for worse. And for Pokemon, we need to step back to the 1990s.